She tore the last bread in two, half for her son, half for Hope. He watched from horseback, unseen behind the pines, a man who thought he'd seen everything. But nothing struck like that moment, and nothing would be the same again. The crust broke in her hands like old bark, brittle and dry, and Ruth Langley tried to soften it with her fingers before placing it gently into her son's trembling palm. Sam was 9, with legs that hadn't worked since he'd been 3, and eyes that understood far too much for a boy his age. He smiled anyway, not because he wasn't hungry, he was starving, but because he knew she needed it. Ruth watched him chew slowly, the corners of his mouth twitching to fight the burn of tears. She turned away. He didn't need to see her cry, not today, not when she had to pretend this would somehow be enough. There was nothing left in the pantry, not a single crumb, not a scoop of flour. The last bread had been stretched from what little she could scrape from the bottom of the sack, and there was no one left to ask, no one who hadn't already said no. Through the narrow window of the old linta they called home, a wind scattered dirt and dry snow like insults across the yard. The barn had collapsed the winter before. The chicken coop stood silent. The only sign of life was a clothesline that had more holes than fabric hanging from it. Ruth pressed a hand to her stomach, willing it quiet. Sam hadn't complained once. That was the part that hurt most. He hadn't asked if there'd be more. He hadn't said a word about the aching hollowness in his belly. He just smiled and thanked her. That kind of grace didn't belong in a world like this. From the hill beyond the tree line, Everett Crane pulled his horse to a halt. He hadn't meant to stop. Truth was, he hadn't even meant to ride that direction. He'd taken the back trail around Cedar Ridge to avoid the main road into town, half to clear his head, half because the last thing he wanted was another saloon boy trying to sell him a silver watch or a fresh bottle of regret. He hadn't expected to see the woman, thin, upright, moving through her yard like a ghost clinging to discipline. He hadn't expected to watch her kneel beside a crippled child and break her last meal between them, and he hadn't expected it to stick in his chest like it did. He could have ridden on, should have, but his hands didn't move. Everett was not a man prone to sentiment. 42 years on this earth had carved that out of him early. He'd buried a wife, a brother, and more horses than he cared to count. He'd built Crane Hollow from a patch of nothing with less help than most men got in a month. He paid well, drank little, and kept mostly to himself. That's how he liked it, or so he'd thought, until he saw a mother give her starving boy the last she had and act like it was the most normal thing in the world. By the time Ruth rose from the floor and folded the cracked plate back into the cupboard, Sam had dozed off on his straw mattress. She tucked the quilt tighter around him and kissed his forehead before blowing out the lamp. Her knees ached as she moved, but she welcomed the pain. It meant she was still here, still able to do something, even if that something wasn't enough. She didn't see the rider that night. Everett had already gone, quietly as he came, but something had shifted in the wind. She felt it, even if she couldn't name it. The next morning dawned bone cold, with a hard frost across the field and no firewood left inside. Ruth pulled on her boots and coat, the same she'd worn every winter for 12 years, and stepped outside with a hatchet. The woodpile was down to splinters, but she'd find something. She always did. Her breath came in clouds as she crossed the brittle yard, but halfway to the stump she stopped. The axe dropped from her fingers. A basket sat on the steps, full. Bread, potatoes, 2 tins of beans. And at the bottom meat, a ham wrapped in cloth still faintly warm. Ruth's hands shook as she lifted it. No note, no tracks, just food. She looked up wildly, eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing. She hadn't imagined it. Sam's face lit like summer when she brought it in. "Mama, is it Christmas?" he asked, and she smiled so hard it cracked her lip. Later that day, Everett walked into Harper's Feed and General with the calm of a man who didn't need to explain himself. He bought double what he needed. When the clerk raised a brow, Everett just muttered something about a ranch hand who'd lost everything in a fire. It wasn't true, but it wasn't false either. Misfortune didn't always need a name. Some things were worth the lie. That afternoon, Ruth lit a proper fire for the first time in weeks. She cooked the potatoes and warmed the ham. She laughed when Sam asked for seconds and cried when he fell asleep with a full belly. But the next morning when she found another parcel, this time with firewood stacked neat beside it, her heart raced. Someone knew. Someone was watching, and she didn't know whether to be afraid or grateful. The third day brought medicine, ointment for Sam's sores, salve for her hands. The fourth brought boots that fit, still no note, no sign. Ruth grew quiet, wary, not because she was ungrateful, but because nothing came free in a world like this. Nothing came without a cost, and kindness was often just the bait. She didn't tell Sam, she didn't want him to worry, but she watched the tree line now with a different gaze. Everett didn't mean for it to go on so long. He thought maybe once or twice just to help. But once he'd started, he couldn't stop. He told himself it was about the boy, but deep down he knew it wasn't just that. There was something in the way Ruth carried herself, something proud even when everything else had been taken. He'd known women who demanded everything for nothing, who blamed and begged in equal measure. Ruth did neither. She gave, even when she had nothing left. A week passed before Ruth decided to follow the tracks. She waited until Sam was asleep, bundled warm. She took the lamp and the rifle just in case and stepped into the dark. The moon was high, casting the world in silver and shadow. She walked slow, following the faint impressions in the snow. They led beyond the ridge, toward the trees, toward the truth. Her heart thudded louder than her boots. She wasn't sure what she expected. A stranger, a trap, a miracle. What she found was a man kneeling beside a stump, placing a sack against a rock like he'd done it 1,000 times. She raised the rifle before she could think. "Don't move." Everett turned slowly. The moon caught his face. He didn't flinch, didn't reach for a weapon. He just straightened, nodded once, and said, "Mrs. Langley." Ruth's arms trembled. "Why?" "Because I saw you give your last bread to a boy who didn't ask for it. And I remembered what it's like to need and have no one see." She didn't lower the rifle, but she didn't fire either. Everett stepped back. "You can keep the rest or not, your choice." He turned, and for a moment, Ruth thought he might disappear into the woods and never come back. But she heard herself say, "Wait." He stopped, and the wind shifted again. They didn't speak for a long time after that, not with words at least. Everett didn't ask for forgiveness, and Ruth didn't offer gratitude. What passed between them in the stillness of that snowy ridge was older than either sentiment. Recognition. That was the word for it. A kind of quiet acknowledgement between two people who had both seen too much of life to believe in charity without suspicion, or kindness without condition. Ruth's grip on the rifle didn't loosen, but her finger drifted from the trigger. Her breath fogged in front of her lips, visible in the moonlight like spirit smoke. Everett didn't take another step. He simply removed his gloves, laid them on the stump beside the sack, and waited. "I didn't ask for this," Ruth said finally, voice low and steady. "I know," Everett replied. "Why me?" He looked past her then, toward the faint outline of the cabin on the ridge. "Because you fed your boy with your last bread," he said quietly. "Didn't think anyone saw." Ruth's heart pulled tight in her chest. She didn't want to cry, not in front of a stranger, not in the cold, not when her fingers were still curled around steel. But something broke loose anyway. Not tears, exactly, but weariness. A kind of collapse that didn't bend the knees or bow the shoulders, but settled in the bones like winter. Everett didn't move. He didn't reach for her or say anything soft. He only stood still, solid and waiting, until the silence between them thickened into something that held rather than crushed. Finally, Ruth lowered the rifle, not because she trusted him, not yet, but because for the first time in years someone had seen her, really seen her, and chosen not to look away. "I've got a pot on," she murmured almost to herself. Everett nodded once. "Wouldn't mind a cup if it's going." That night they sat across from each other at her table, a battered wooden thing that listed slightly to the left. The lamp flickered above them, casting shadows that danced along the crooked walls. Sam slept nearby, curled in his quilt with one hand beneath his cheek. Ruth watched him for a long moment before setting down her mug. "I don't want charity," she said, the words nearly catching in her throat. "You didn't take any," Everett replied. I left food, you didn't beg for it, there's a difference. She met his eyes across the table. There wasn't judgment in them, just truth. Why are you really here? She asked. Everett stared into his cup like it might hold the answer he couldn't find in himself. Been asking that same question, he muttered. Guess I'm trying to remember what it means to be useful. I've got more than I need. Always figured I earned it. Lately I ain't so sure. Ruth didn't respond. She didn't know what to say to a man who had everything but carried himself like he didn't deserve any of it. Instead, she stood and stirred the fire, adding another log with careful fingers. When she sat back down, her shoulders were still drawn tight, but her voice had softened. My husband was a miner, she said. Silver up in Blue Hollow. Shaft collapsed. Took 7 men. Sam was 3, never walked again. Everett's hand stilled. I'm sorry. Don't be. It's not your burden. Maybe not, he said. But we all carry each other whether we want to or not. That's the point of a town, or used to be. Ruth's mouth pulled tight at the corners. Then, where was that town when the mines shut down and the pay stopped coming? When the doctor started charging coin I didn't have? When the folks who used to wave stopped looking me in the eye? Everett didn't answer. He couldn't. Ruth leaned back, folding her arms. I used to think I was proud. Turns out I was just desperate. Those two things don't always live apart, Everett said softly. For a long while, they sat in silence. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't bitter either. It was the kind of silence that happens when two lives run parallel for too long and suddenly find themselves intersecting. When Everett stood to leave, Ruth followed him to the door. The wind had died, but the cold lingered. Outside, the snow gleamed silver under the moon. You'll come again, she asked, not quite looking at him. He hesitated, then nodded. If you'll have me. She didn't smile, but she didn't close the door behind him either, not until long after his footsteps faded. Over the next week, Everett returned. Not every day, not on any schedule she could predict, but often enough that the silence between visits started to feel like waiting. He brought supplies at first, more food, wool socks for Sam, a spare coat that hung heavy on Ruth's frame but warmed her better than anything she'd had in years. Then came books, a lantern that didn't sputter, fresh pencils for Sam who, it turned out, loved to draw. Ruth tried to repay him in small ways. An extra cup of coffee, a stitch mended in his worn gloves, a loaf of bread made with the last of the yeast she'd stored in a jar behind the stove. But Everett wasn't after repayment. That much was clear. He helped fix the roof after a hard wind snapped the corner beam. He replaced the broken hinge on the outhouse without being asked. One afternoon, he chopped wood without a word and stacked it against the wall so neatly it looked like something from a picture book. Sam began waiting by the window near dusk, asking every hour whether Mr. Crane might be by today. Ruth told herself it was for Sam's sake she didn't mind the visits, but she knew better. She felt it every time she heard boots on the steps. Then came the morning the letter arrived. Ruth found it tucked beneath the front door. No stamp, no envelope, just folded paper creased twice. She opened it with careful fingers. The handwriting was unfamiliar, uneven, but clear. You're not forgotten. Someone still remembers what your husband did for that mine. Come to the meeting house in Shiloh Forks, Thursday, noon. No signature, no explanation, just those words. Ruth stared at the page for a long time. She hadn't been to Shiloh Forks in years, not since the funeral. It was 2 towns east, half a day's ride, and she didn't own a horse anymore. But something about the note clung to her, something about the way it said not forgotten. That afternoon, Everett arrived to find Ruth pacing the yard, the letter clutched in her hand. You look like a woman trying to decide between a fire and a flood, he said by way of greeting. Ruth didn't smile, she just handed him the letter. He read it twice, then handed it back. You thinking of going? I don't know. I can take you. It might be nothing. Or it might not. She looked at him then, really looked. "Why are you doing all this?" He didn't answer at first. He walked to the fence, leaned against it, stared out at the field that had once been corn, now just brittle stalks. "I spent a long time building a ranch so big no one could touch me," he said. "Took longer still to realize I built it around a grave." Ruth didn't ask whose. Everett turned back to her. "Let me take you to Shiloh Forks." She nodded slowly. "All right." That night Ruth sat beside Sam as he slept and ran her fingers through his hair. The letter lay folded on the table. She hadn't dared hope in years, but something was moving, and for the first time she didn't feel entirely alone. The wind that morning rolled in sharp and low, bending the grass along the fence line and carrying the scent of something older than rain, something like memory. Ruth stood in the doorway of her cabin, shawl drawn tight, watching as Everett fastened the last strap on the buckboard's harness. The mare was sturdy and sure-footed, with the kind of calm that didn't rattle easy. Sam watched from the window, his face pale with worry and curiosity all mixed together. "You sure you'll be all right, honey?" Ruth called softly, leaning through the doorway. Sam gave a crooked grin. "You always say I'm the brave one." She smiled back, but her hands trembled. It had been nearly 6 years since she'd left Bitter Run, and longer still since she dared ride into Shiloh Forks. She didn't even know what she hoped to find. A name. A debt long forgotten. A hand held out that didn't expect something back. But whatever it was, it had drawn her out of her shell of survival and into something closer to motion. And motion, as her father used to say, was the first sign of the living. Everett helped her onto the seat without a word. His hand was firm but gentle, like he'd done this 100 times. Ruth settled beside him, adjusting the folds of her skirt and glancing once more toward the cabin, where Sam's little face pressed against the glass. "Let's go," she whispered, and Everett clicked the reins. They traveled in silence for the first hour. The road was muddy from melted frost, and the trees leaned over it like old men whispering warnings. Ruth watched the world pass by in streaks of brown and gray, the colors of hardship. But every now and then Everett would glance at her, not probing, not pitying, just making sure she was still there, still whole. She appreciated that more than he could know. Eventually she spoke. "You said something the other night," she murmured, "about building a grave." Everett's jaw tightened. He didn't answer immediately. "My wife," he said finally, "Clara, died before I ever built the ranch. She was pregnant. We lost both. I thought if I worked hard enough, built something big enough, I could fill the space where they ought to be. Never quite managed it." Ruth turned to face him. "You never remarried?" "No." "Why?" He glanced at her, eyes unreadable. "Didn't think it'd be fair to ask someone to live beside a memory that heavy." Ruth nodded slowly. "I know that weight." They didn't speak again for miles, but something passed between them in that quiet, an easing, a mutual loosening of the invisible knots they both carried. By the time the steeple of the old meeting house appeared on the ridge, Ruth's hands were clammy with nerves. The town hadn't changed much. A few new shingles on the saloon roof, a fresh coat of paint on the smithy, but it was the same place where she'd stood beside a pine coffin and watched the last good part of her life get lowered into the earth. The wagon creaked to a stop. Everett offered his hand again, and Ruth took it, steadier this time. They walked together up the short path to the meeting house door. Inside, the room was dim, lit by shafts of dusty light that cut across the floorboards. About a dozen people sat scattered across the benches, men and women in worn coats and lined faces. No one looked wealthy. No one looked powerful. They looked like survivors. A man in a checkered vest stood at the front, his beard grayer than his eyes. He saw Ruth and nodded. "Mrs. Langley." She swallowed and stepped forward. "Yes." "Name S. Harlan Graves. I worked with your husband in the Hollow. He saved my life that day." Ruth's heart slammed in her chest. "I wrote to the mining board after it happened. Told them he braced the shaft with his own body long enough for me and 2 others to crawl free. They never answered, but I kept copies, letters, testimonies, thought maybe one day something. He gestured to a folder on the table. Turns out they finally settled with the families. Quietly, of course. No headlines, but there's compensation, land grants, some cash. Not much, but more than most folks round here see in a year. Ruth couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her fingers reached for the folder like it might vanish if she blinked. "There's more," Harlan said. "A doctor in Crescent Hill, specializes in spinal injuries, takes charity cases. I've got a contact there. If you're willing, I can help you send your boy." It felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. "Why?" she whispered. "Because we were buried once," Harlan said simply, "and your husband gave us the breath to crawl out." Ruth pressed the folder to her chest like it might fall apart otherwise. "I don't know what to say." "Don't need to say anything, just don't disappear. There's folks who remember, and who don't want you to keep suffering in the dark." Everett stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "She won't." They rode back in silence, but this time the silence was full. Ruth didn't cry, not yet. She just sat with the folder in her lap and the wind in her hair and the sense that something had shifted permanently. Not a miracle, but something close. Sam was waiting on the porch when they returned, blanket around his shoulders. When he saw the look on her face, his eyes went wide. "Mama," he asked. She knelt beside him and held the folder out. "Your papa didn't die for nothing," she said. "There's a doctor, and there's a future." Sam blinked hard. "I'm gonna walk." Ruth didn't know, not for sure, but for the first time she believed it might be possible. "You're gonna try," she whispered, "and that's more than we had yesterday." That night, after Sam had fallen asleep clutching a pencil and drawing his first picture of a new life, Ruth stood outside and looked up at the stars. Everett joined her, arms crossed, boots crunching in the gravel. "You did that," she said. He shook his head. "No, you did, I just pointed the way." She glanced at him, face illuminated in the moonlight. "You keep showing up like this, Everett Crane, and I might start thinking the world hasn't gone all cold." He didn't smile, but his voice was warm when he spoke. "Maybe it hasn't, not entirely." She leaned against him without thinking. He didn't move away. But just as the silence settled, another sound crept through the dark. Hooves multiple. Ruth stiffened. Everett's hand went to his side where he always kept a small iron tucked beneath his coat. Down the ridge, 5 riders emerged from the trees, not fast, not loud, but purposeful. Ruth squinted. One of the men was broad-shouldered and rode with the kind of posture that screamed authority, and she knew that silhouette. "Oh God," she breathed, "it's Jasper." Everett's jaw clenched. "Friend of yours?" "No," she whispered, "my husband's brother." "What's he doing here?" "I don't know," Ruth said, "but he's never come for anything good." Everett nodded once and stepped forward. "Stay inside," he said. Ruth didn't argue. She turned, heart racing, and ran for the door, calling for Sam. The boy stirred, confused, but the look on her face told him not to ask questions. Outside, Everett stood tall as the riders approached. Jasper Langley pulled his horse to a stop, sneer already forming. "Even in, stranger," Jasper said. "Heard my brother left a widow and a boy with nothing. Figured I'd come collect what's left of the land." Everett didn't move. "Ain't nothing here that belongs to you." Jasper smirked. "Oh, I think we'll let the papers decide that." Ruth stood just inside the doorway, clutching the folder to her chest. Everett didn't glance back, but his voice was low and dangerous. "You come for paper, you'll leave disappointed. You come for blood, you better be ready to lose some." Jasper leaned back in his saddle. "You threatening me, rancher?" "I don't make threats," Everett said. "I make promises." Jasper's eyes narrowed. "This ain't over." "No," Everett replied. "It's just beginning." The riders didn't linger, not that night. Jasper Langley was too smart for that. He saw the steel in Everett's posture, the rifle just inside the doorway, and the way Ruth stood with the same quiet steadiness she'd shown the day her husband was buried. This wasn't the hollow widow he expected. This was a woman who had found her spine again. He spat in the snow and turned his horse, but not before flashing a look that Ruth had seen before, the kind of look that said a man wasn't done, only delayed. The kind that promised return. The others followed, glancing over their shoulders as they faded into the trees, hooves muffled by frost and pine needles. Ruth stood still until the last of the hoofbeats disappeared, her breath tight in her chest. Inside, Sam had curled beneath the quilt, but his eyes stayed open, wide and searching. "Was that Uncle Jasper?" he asked, voice thin. Ruth knelt beside him. "Yes." "Is he gonna try and take our house?" She didn't answer right away. She reached out and smoothed his hair, the weight of the folder still pressing against her ribs like armor and burden all at once. "We're not letting anyone take anything from us again," she said finally. "Not ever." Outside, Everett stood unmoving beneath the eaves, watching the dark as if expecting it to split wide and bare its fangs. Ruth joined him, arms folded tight against her chest. "He'll be back," she said. "I know." "What does he want?" "Land control, you." Ruth flinched. Everett kept his gaze forward. Men like him don't show up unless they're hungry, and he looked starved. She looked up at him. "I don't have anything left to steal." "You've got more than you think, and he knows it." She didn't ask what he meant by that. She didn't need to. Some truths were better left floating in the space between silence and understanding. The days that followed crawled slow, each one strung tighter than the last. Ruth tried to keep life steady. She made porridge every morning, helped Sam with his drawings, and mended the tears in Everett's shirts with the same care she once used on her husband. Everett returned every evening, never saying exactly why, but always coming with some reason. A broken gate to fix, a new batch of bread flour, a tin of dried apples that made Sam light up like Christmas. But Ruth saw it in his eyes. He was waiting, watching. She found herself doing the same. Each night she double-checked the latch on the door and kept a lantern burning low in the corner. Each night she listened to the wind for hooves. And each night her thoughts drifted to the folder still tucked beneath her mattress, the papers Harlan had given her, the promise of compensation, the name of the doctor in Crescent Hill. She hadn't written yet. She didn't know how to ask, didn't know how to hope that hard. Then came the letter. Everett brought it in one evening, handed it to her with a stiff jaw and downcast eyes. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. Ruth tore it open and read in silence. "Ruth Langley. This land was promised to my brother's family. By rights it belongs to me now. I've spoken to the county clerk. He says your claim is flimsy at best. I'll be back Friday to settle this. If you're smart, you'll be gone by then. Jasper Langley." Ruth sat down hard. The words felt like a punch, not because they were unexpected, but because they made real what she'd been trying not to admit. Everett leaned against the table. "He's bluffing." "He always bluffs first," Ruth whispered. "Then he follows through. You have the papers from the mine. And he has the clerk." Everett didn't argue. He didn't offer empty promises. He just looked at her, steady and unshaken. "I'll be here Friday." Ruth closed her eyes. "I don't want blood on this land." "Neither do I. But I won't run. I wouldn't let you." They didn't speak again that night, but Ruth felt something shift between them, no longer just quiet companionship or shared sorrow. It was something fiercer, something that might have been love if either of them had believed they deserved it. The next morning, Ruth woke early. She dressed in silence, pulled the folder from beneath the bed and sat at the table. With her hands shaking, she wrote to the doctor in Crescent Hill. She told him about Sam, about the accident, about the pain that came with watching your child smile through suffering. She folded the letter, sealed it, and stared at it for a long time before slipping it into Everett's coat. "If something happens," she said, "promise me you'll get this to him." Everett didn't ask questions, he just nodded. Friday came fast. The sky was a washed-out gray, heavy with a storm that hadn't yet decided whether to fall. Ruth made eggs, fed Sam, swept the floor twice though it didn't need it. Everett arrived before noon, his rifle slung low, a quiet resolve in his every step. They waited. Sam stayed inside, watching from the window, clutching his newest drawing, a sketch of a house with wide doors and a garden full of sunflowers. Ruth stood beside Everett on the porch. She wore her husband's old coat and her own sharpness like armor. The riders came just past 3:06 this time. Jasper rode in front, wearing the same smugness as always, though there was a tension in his posture she hadn't seen before. "Afternoon," he said, voice oily. Ruth didn't move. "You're not welcome here." Jasper raised an eyebrow. "Funny, that's not what the law says." Everett stepped forward. "You're not the law." "No," Jasper replied, "but I know how to buy it." Behind him, one of the men dismounted and began walking toward the shed. "Stop," Everett said, rifle raised. The man froze. "You're trespassing," Ruth said. Jasper sighed. "I gave you the chance to leave peacefully." "And I gave you the chance to be decent," Ruth replied. "You wasted it." Jasper's smile disappeared. He turned to his men. "Get them off the land." Time fractured. Everett moved first, his rifle cracking once, sending dirt spraying at the boots of the advancing man. It was a warning, but it was clear. Ruth ducked back inside, slammed the door and locked it. She pushed Sam beneath the bed and handed him a pillow. "Don't move," she whispered. Outside shouting, hooves, another shot closer this time. Ruth grabbed the rifle Everett had given her and opened the window just enough to see. One man had fallen. Another was backing away, arms raised. Everett stood like a storm himself, calm, inevitable. "Call them off, Jasper," Ruth shouted through the door. But Jasper wasn't listening. He was advancing now, hand on his own gun, hatred etched deep in his face. "You think you can stand against me?" he snarled. "You think anyone's gonna come help some dried-out widow and her crippled brat?" That was the moment Ruth stepped outside. She didn't raise her rifle. She didn't need to. Her voice carried sharper than any bullet. "You talk a lot for a man who never earned a thing in his life." Jasper froze. "This house was built with sweat and blood," she continued. "My husband's bones are in the earth beneath our feet. My son has lived through more pain than you'll ever know, and we are still here. You think threats can scare me now?" Jasper's face twisted. He raised his weapon. And Everett stepped forward, rifle aimed dead center. "Go ahead," he said, "but you won't leave standing." The standoff held for one breathless second. Then another. Then slowly, Jasper lowered his gun. He looked at Ruth with something like disgust and fear. "This ain't over," he said. "No," Ruth replied, "but you are." He turned his horse. The others followed. One limped. One glanced back with something like regret in his eyes. And just like that, they were gone. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise. Everett lowered his rifle. Ruth exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours, and Sam peeked through the window, his eyes wide and shining. "You did it," he whispered. Ruth turned to Everett, who looked like a man who hadn't wanted to fight but had known he would. "We did it," she said. Inside, the fire still burned. Outside, the wind shifted. And for the first time in a long time, Ruth Langley felt like the ground beneath her feet belonged to her again. The storm came after all late that night, long after the riders had vanished beyond the ridge. It didn't bring thunder or wind, only a slow, relentless fall of snow, soft as silence and just as suffocating. Ruth sat by the hearth long after Sam had fallen asleep, staring into the flickering orange as if it could tell her what came next. The house was still standing. The land was still theirs, but nothing about her felt settled. Everett hadn't left. He sat across from her, boots stretched toward the fire, cup of coffee cooling untouched in his hands. He hadn't said much since Jasper left, and she hadn't pressed. Some men were made of few words and too many memories. And tonight, she didn't need speech. She needed the weight of his presence, the way he filled the silence without swallowing it. When she finally spoke, it was low, nearly a whisper. "He's not done." Everett looked at her then, eyes dark and certain. "I know. He'll try another way, he always does. I'll be ready." Her hand curled tighter around her cup. "He used to come by after Thomas died, said he wanted to make things right, brought sugar, flour once, sat on the porch and talked like we were old friends, but I could see it in his face. He didn't want to help, he wanted to own." Everett's jaw tightened. "I told him no, again and again. That last time he brought a deed, already filled out, just waiting for my signature. Said the mine owed him too, that he was just taking what should have been his." "Did you tell anyone?" She laughed bitterly. "Who would I tell? Sheriff said Jasper had business ties in half the county. The pastor offered prayers and a pie. No one wanted to cross him. Except you." She met his eyes. "I didn't think I had a choice." "You didn't," Everett said, "and you still don't." He set his cup down, leaned forward. "This land's yours, Ruth, and not just by ink or memory. You planted roots here. You bled here. That matters more than Jasper's money ever will." She looked down, heart thudding. "What if he brings the law next time?" she asked. "What if he really finds a way to take it all?" Everett didn't hesitate. "Then we show him something stronger than law." She blinked. "What?" "Community." It sounded simple, too simple, but something about the word caught in her chest. "The people in Bitter Run," he continued. "They know what you've been through. Some of 'em owe you more than they admit. You fed them when you had nothing. You watched their children when they were sick. You're not forgotten, Ruth. You just think you are." Ruth shook her head. "They don't care." "Maybe not all, but some, and some is enough." She stared at him, unsure whether to believe him or her fear. Then Everett stood. "I'll ride out tomorrow, talk to Harlan again, see what can be done legal-wise, but more than that I'll talk to people, the kind who don't speak loud but listen sharp. Let them know what's happening." Ruth rose too, "And me. You stay with Sam, get ready. Winter's not over and neither's Jasper." That night, after Everett had bedded down in the lean-to beside the barn, Ruth crawled into bed beside Sam, her arms curled protectively around his fragile frame. He didn't stir, but she could feel his breath, slow and warm against her collarbone. She kissed his hair and whispered, "We're gonna make it." She didn't know if he heard. She didn't even know if she believed it yet. But she said it again anyway. "We're gonna make it." Everett rode out at dawn, coat snapping behind him like a flag. Ruth stood on the porch and watched until he vanished over the hill, the same ache stirring in her chest that she remembered from the day Thomas left for the mines. The day everything broke. But Everett wasn't Thomas. Thomas had been good and kind, but always hoping for the world to do right by him. Everett didn't wait for the world. He pushed back. The next 2 days passed in a haze. Ruth spent them cleaning every corner of the house, mending every scrap of clothing, baking what little she could from their stores. She taught Sam to sew buttons and watched his fingers fumble through the task with stubborn pride. She boiled snow water, made poultices, stitched shut the torn edge of Everett's coat. It felt foolish, maybe, like preparing for battle with bread and thread. But it helped. On the 3rd day, Everett returned. He was soaked through, hat heavy with ice, but his face held something close to fire. "I talked to Harlan. He sent a wire to the district clerk, Turns out your claim was never processed proper after the mine collapse. He's fixing that. Ruth's heart skipped. Will it help? Maybe, but we've got more than that now. He pulled something from his saddlebag and laid it on the table, a stack of folded pages, worn from handling. Letters, he said, from folks in town, some signed, some not, all saying the same thing: they won't stand by if Jasper tries again. Ruth picked one up. The handwriting was familiar. Delilah Parsons, the woman who ran the dress shop 2 winters ago. Ruth had once watched her daughter for 3 days straight while she recovered from pneumonia. It said simply, Ruth Langley is owed more than land, she's owed peace. I'll stand with her. She read another, then another. By the time she reached the bottom of the stack, tears blurred her vision. Why do they help now? She asked. Everett shrugged. Sometimes people need reminding what courage looks like. She stared at him, trying to read the truth behind his calm. You did this. He looked away. Just asked a few questions, put your name in the right ears. But why? Why are you doing all this for me? He hesitated. Because I watched you break bread you couldn't spare for a boy who didn't know how to ask. Because I've seen the way you look at your son, like every breath he takes is a miracle. Because when I was drowning in silence, your voice was the first thing that didn't feel like noise. Her throat tightened. I don't know how to be grateful big enough for that. You don't have to. They stood in the hush that followed, the fire crackling low, the weight of too many losses hovering between them. Then Sam burst through the curtain, face flushed. Someone's coming. Ruth rushed to the window, heart stuttering. Not riders. A wagon. Covered, ragged, driven by an old man with hands too stiff to grip the reins clean. Harlan. Behind him, 2 more wagons. Families, men, women, even children. What? Ruth whispered. Everett smiled. You said you didn't want to fight this alone. The wagons rolled in slow. Some carried tools, others sacks of grain or timber or canned goods. One man hoisted a placard as he stepped down. This land feeds the hungry. It deserves protection. Ruth stepped outside, eyes wide. Delilah was there. So was Pastor Merton, and Isaac from the blacksmith shop, even sour-faced Alma, who once refused to sell Ruth a can of peaches for less than double. They came not with weapons but with presence, with witness. We'll stay until the snow passes, Harlan said. Make sure Jasper understands this land is spoken for. Ruth couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Then Sam was at her side, clutching her hand. Is it over? He asked. No, she whispered, but for once we're not outnumbered. That night the house overflowed. Families bunked on floorboards and hay bales. Children played under quilts and chased each other through the barn. Harlan played harmonica by the fire while Everett strung lanterns between fence posts. Ruth moved through it all like a woman learning to walk again. The house she thought too quiet had become a refuge. The land she feared losing now held more feet than it had in years. And for the first time since Thomas's death, she dreamed not of endings but of beginnings. But outside on the hill above the ridge, someone watched. Jasper sat atop his horse, coat pulled tight, eyes narrowed against the dark. He saw the firelight, heard the faint sound of laughter. And his jaw clenched. He turned, rode back into the trees. Next time he would not come alone. By morning, the frost on the windows had turned to dew, and the hard edge of winter softened beneath a pale thaw. Smoke rose from the chimneys not just of Ruth's cabin, but of makeshift stoves and small fires dug carefully into the snow-packed earth. Children's laughter echoed from behind the barn where they chased one another through drifts now crusted with ice, and voices, so many voices, filled the clearing. The Langley homestead, for the first time in years, sounded alive. Ruth stood at the kitchen window, watching steam rise from the coffee she poured into tin cups, one after the next. The pot was nearly empty already, and it was barely past sunrise. She wasn't used to cooking for so many. Not since before Thomas died. Not since Bitter Run's mind swallowed a dozen men and the world went quiet. But her hands didn't shake as they used to, and her spine no longer curved from carrying too much grief. She moved to the table, laid out the cups, and turned just as Everett came in from the cold. He stamped snow from his boots and gave her a nod, the kind that had come to mean more than words. A quiet assurance, "I'm here. We're not done yet." "Anything?" she asked. He shook his head. "All quiet last night. One of Harlan's boys took first watch. Isaac's out there now." Ruth glanced past him, to the soft glow of lanterns along the ridge and the shape of a man standing with a shotgun resting easy across his chest. She still couldn't believe it, that these people had come, not just to keep Jasper away, but to stake something deeper. A belief, a line in the dirt. "You sleep?" Everett asked. "A little." He moved to the table and picked up one of the cups, blowing on it before taking a long sip. "They'll stay through the week," Harlan said. "Maybe longer if it looks like Jasper's making a move." She nodded, and her hands stilled where they'd been wiping the edge of the counter. "He won't take this lying down." "No," Everett said, "but he won't walk through fire to get it either." "What makes you so sure?" "Because this time, it's not just you he'd have to burn." She exhaled slowly. "I still don't know why they came." "Because of who you are, Ruth." "No, they came because of who you are," she said, turning to face him. "They trust you, they follow you." Everett looked away. "Maybe, but they came for you." She didn't argue, not because she believed it, but because some truths need time to sink in. The morning wore on, the sun breaking through in shy slats of warmth that dusted the frozen earth. Sam wheeled himself through the yard, the rough wooden spokes of his chair groaning against the path Everett had cleared for him. Leah, Delilah's youngest, walked beside him, holding a small tin lunchbox filled with hard-boiled eggs and biscuits she insisted he had to try. Ruth watched them from the porch, heart aching and full at once. She remembered when Sam couldn't even sit up without pain, when he flinched at every bump and turn, when the doctors had said the damage might be permanent. And now, here he was, grinning up at a girl his age, pretending not to be proud of how far he could wheel himself before the snow stopped him. Harlan joined her, easing onto the top step with a grunt. "He's a strong one," he said, nodding toward Sam. "He's had to be." Harlan rested his hands on his knees. "Reminds me of my boy when he was that age, stubborn as a goat, thought he could lasso a thunderstorm." Ruth smiled. "Did he?" "Nearly broke his arm trying." They sat for a while in silence. Harlan sipped his coffee, eyes tracking the tree line. "You know," he said eventually, "Jasper Langley's not used to being outnumbered." "I know. Men like him, they don't take humiliation lightly, especially not from a woman who's supposed to be quiet and grateful." "I'm not quiet," Ruth said. "No," Harlan agreed, "and you damn sure ain't grateful to him." She let out a slow breath. "Are we ready?" Harlan nodded. "We've got 6 more men coming from the mill. Isaac wired them yesterday. Pastor Mertens pulled together a list of everyone who's willing to swear a statement in town, people who saw Jasper threaten you, try to force you off. Even that sour-faced widow Alma signed one." Ruth blinked. "Alma." Harlan chuckled. "Turns out you're not the only woman Jasper's tried to corner." A shadow passed across Ruth's expression, but she said nothing. "What about the deed?" she asked. "Filed it myself. Everett's got the receipt." Ruth looked down at her hands, then up at the hills beyond the clearing. "Then it's just a matter of time." "That's all it ever is," Harlan said. "Time and truth." That night the snow began to fall again. Not heavy, just enough to remind them that winter hadn't released its grip. But the fires kept burning, and the laughter of children floated over the rooftops like smoke. Ruth sat beside Sam's bed, listening to him breathe, stroking his hair with fingers she hadn't realized were trembling. "Ma," he whispered. "Yes, baby. I heard Harlan say something today, about you not giving up, about how you stood your ground." She smiled faintly. "I just did what I had to." "But you didn't run." "No," she said, "I didn't run." Sam turned his face toward her. "Does that mean we can stay, really stay?" She leaned down and kissed his forehead. "I think it does." Jasper Langley returned 3 days later. He didn't bring men with guns this time. He brought a wagon and 2 men in suits. They rode into the clearing with the kind of entitlement that had no need for secrecy. Ruth heard the wheels long before she saw them, heard the creak of polished wood and the clatter of shined boots, and she knew this wasn't a raid. It was a performance. Everett and Harlan were already on the porch when Ruth stepped out. She crossed her arms, jaw set. The rest of the camp watched from behind trees and fences, silent. The wagon stopped a dozen paces from the door. Jasper stepped down first. His coat was pressed. His boots shined. He looked less like a cattleman and more like a banker, and Ruth hated him more for it. The 2 men behind him adjusted their spectacles and stepped forward. "Ruth Langley?" one of them asked. "Yes. I'm Wallace Graves, from the county assessor's office. This is my colleague, Mr. Dunley. We've come to discuss a claim against your property." Ruth said nothing. Beside her, Everett's face darkened. Graves opened a folder. According to records filed in 1881, this parcel of land belonged to Mr. Thomas Langley. Upon his passing, no legal transfer of ownership was recorded. "I was his wife," Ruth said. "We lived here, raised a family here." "Be that as it may," Graves replied. "Without proper probate, the land reverts to the next of kin, in this case, his brother, Mr. Jasper Langley." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ruth felt the ground tilt beneath her, not from surprise, but from the weight of the trap she'd always feared was waiting. Everett stepped forward. "That's not the full record. We have documents, filed and stamped. A transfer of claim from the Bitter Run Mining Company as restitution for Thomas's death." Graves raised a brow. "Do you have these documents on hand?" Everett produced the folder, pulled the pages free, and handed them over. Graves and Dunley read in silence. Behind them, Jasper stood smug and silent. After a long pause, Graves looked up. "These are valid." Jasper's face twitched. "But they predate the probate window," Dunley added, "which means the claim is legally contestable unless ratified by a county judge." Ruth stepped down from the porch. Her voice didn't shake. "Then let's go to the judge." Graves hesitated. "Ma'am, a hearing could take months." "I'm not leaving, and neither is my son. If Jasper wants this land, he can fight for it in daylight, with paper and law, not threats." Jasper stepped forward. "You think the court's gonna side with a broke widow over me?" Ruth didn't flinch. "I think they'll side with truth." He opened his mouth, but Everett was faster. "You should go, Jasper, before you lose more than your pride." For a moment, no one moved. Then, without a word, Jasper turned, climbed back into the wagon. The suits followed. As they rolled away, Ruth turned to Everett. "What happens now?" "We wait, we prepare, and we don't give him an inch." She nodded, and her breath came easier than it had in months. The house held, the land held. And Ruth Langley, poor widow, mother of one, held too. The letter came 4 days later, pressed between the folds of an old canvas saddlebag Everett had left by the fire. Ruth found it early, before the house had stirred, before the frost on the windows had even begun to melt. It was crisp and stamped, bearing the county's official seal, the ink still fresh enough to glisten. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The court date was set. 3 weeks from Friday, in a small town over the ridge. A formal hearing before Judge Walcott to resolve Jasper Langley's claim. No guns, no threats, just words and law and whatever proof she could carry on her back. She read it twice, then a third time, and when the weight of it settled deep enough to steal her breath, she folded it clean and set it on the table like it was just another recipe card. Behind her the kettle hissed, the sun rose, and Bitter Run began to wake again. That same morning Everett walked the fence line. The horses had pressed into the corner near the tree stand again, spooked by something. He couldn't say what, no signs of wolves, no fresh prints in the snow, but the air had a strange edge to it, like a quiet before a scream. He rolled his shoulders, tried to shake it off. Inside, Ruth dressed Sam in layers, tucked hot stones wrapped in cloth beneath his blanket, and wheeled him to the porch. He'd been coughing again, not deep or constant, but enough to worry her. She didn't say it aloud, not yet, but something about the way his eyes looked, glassy and tired, sent a coil of fear tightening inside her gut. Harlan returned before noon. He rode hard, face wind-burned, jaw locked tight. "They're stirring trouble," he said without dismounting. "I stopped in Tallow Creek for supplies. Heard Jasper's offered coin to anyone who'll swear she threatened him." Ruth narrowed her eyes. "They'll lie for money." "Some will, but others won't." "Will it matter?" she asked. "Truth doesn't hold the same weight it used to." "It does," Everett said from the porch. "It just sinks slower." Harlan nodded. "I'll keep asking around. There's folks with long memories. Might be time they remembered who helped them through the lean years." That night Ruth wrote a letter, then another, then 3 more, all in careful cursive, her fingers blistering from the pressure of the pen. She addressed them to names she hadn't spoken in years: old neighbors, a teacher from Sam's school, a boy she once nursed through a fever when his own mother had been too drunk to do it. She didn't ask for help. She reminded them what they'd already received. The day before the court hearing, Everett loaded the wagon. Blankets, 2 changes of clothes, Sam's chair folded tight, Ruth's worn satchel filled with papers, letters, witness statements, and the letter from the county assessor confirming her legal stake in the land. Harlan arrived with Alma and Delilah, both dressed like Sunday but armed with sharp tongues and sharper eyes. "We're common," Delilah said. "Judge might listen better when he sees just who this land belongs to." Ruth tried to thank them. Alma just waved her off. "You can thank us when that bastard's red face turns white in front of the judge." They rode out at first light, the frost burning off as the sun rose. Ruth sat up front beside Everett, Sam bundled beside her. He barely coughed now, but his skin was pale, his hands too cold despite the layers. She kept glancing at him, tucking blankets tighter, whispering prayers she didn't know if she believed in. The courthouse in Darrow's Hill was a squat stone building with an iron bell and a sagging roof. But the crowd outside was already thick, a mix of ranchers, townsfolk, and onlookers drawn by whispers of a showdown too strange to ignore. Inside, the room filled fast. Jasper was already there, seated in a black coat sharp enough to cut glass, his lawyer beside him, some polished man from the city with eyes that didn't blink. Ruth stepped through the door and felt all those stares settle on her. She didn't flinch. She walked straight down the center aisle, Sam's chair creaking beneath her hand, Everett beside her like a stone wall. The judge was older than she expected, heavy brows, tired eyes. "State your claim," he said, voice thin but firm. Jasper's lawyer rose, listing every technicality they'd managed to scrape from the county records: Thomas's death, the missing probate, the original deed naming Jasper as executor. He spoke fast, smooth, like he'd practiced the story 100 times. Then it was Ruth's turn. She stood slowly, unfolding a copy of the deed she'd carried every day since Everett first handed it to her. Her voice didn't shake. "My husband died in that mine. The company settled with me and gave me that land as part of their restitution. I raised my boy there. I buried my hope there. Every fence post was driven by my hand." The judge asked questions about dates, about signatures, about witnesses. Delilah and Harlan both spoke, calm and clear. Alma, too, to the court's surprise. She recounted seeing Jasper at Ruth's door more than once, always leaving angry, once shouting loud enough to wake half the holler. The lawyer tried to object, but the judge waved him off. Then Sam spoke. His voice was soft, but it rang like a bell. "I was there," he said. "Every night, every winter. I saw my ma break her back for that land. I saw her give away the last of our bread to a man who never asked her name." He pointed to Everett. "She taught me that kindness don't need a reason." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge leaned forward. When it was over and they stepped outside, Ruth could barely breathe. "We won't hear his ruling until tomorrow," Everett said, hand on her back. "But I think you did it." "I didn't do it alone." "No," he said, "but you walked in there with more strength than I've ever seen." That night they stayed in a boarding house at the edge of town. Ruth lay beside Sam, listening to him sleep, counting every breath like it might vanish. Then the knock came. Soft, almost apologetic. She rose, pulled a shawl around her shoulders, and opened the door. Jasper stood there. No coat, no lawyer, just him. "You won't win," he said. Ruth didn't blink. "I already have." He stepped closer. "You think these people will stay with you? That Everett'll keep protecting you when the crowds go home?" She didn't answer. Jasper's voice lowered. "They always leave." But Ruth only looked past him, toward the hallway where Everett's shadow had already appeared, silent and steady. "They're not here for me," she said. "They're here because people like you made them forget what right looks like." He stared at her, then turned, walked away. Ruth closed the door, locked it. And for the first time in years, she felt something settle deep in her chest, like soil finally tilled after a long, bitter season. Tomorrow the ruling would come. Tomorrow she'd find out what the law thought of her life. But tonight she'd already planted something stronger. Faith. And she knew it would grow. The bell over the courthouse rang slow and low the next morning, tolling out across Darrow's Hill like the voice of something old and certain. Ruth sat beside Sam on the same bench where they'd waited the day before, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. His fever had broken in the early hours, and though his skin was still warm and pale, his breathing had steadied. Everett stood near the door, arms folded, gaze locked on the courtroom's main chamber as if daring fate to change its mind. It had been a long night, not just because of Sam's illness or the silence Jasper had left behind when he'd vanished into the shadows, but because of the quiet certainty that no matter how the court ruled, nothing would ever return to how it was. Not for Ruth, not for the town, not for Everett Halloway. When the bailiff finally called her name, Ruth rose with the steadiness of someone who had nothing left to prove. She didn't flinch when the courtroom turned to face her. She didn't falter when Jasper walked in, expression unreadable, his city lawyer trailing behind him with a stack of papers clutched to his chest like a lifeline. Judge Walcott sat back in his chair, hands folded over the final ruling he had penned in long strokes through the night. The parchment in front of him bore only a few lines, but those lines carried the weight of every mile Ruth had walked, every blister she had ignored, every winter she'd braved with nothing but firewood and a mother's will to endure. "This court," the judge began, voice clear despite his age, "finds the land deeded to Mrs. Ruth Langley as part of the restitution granted by the Bitter Run Mining Company to be legally binding and valid. The claim presented by Mr. Jasper Langley is therefore dismissed." There was no outburst, no applause, just silence. Then the sound of a breath, hers, falling out of her lungs like something she'd held for 10 years too long. She didn't cry. Not when the judge signed the paper. Not when Everett gripped her arm, steady and proud. Not even when Sam, pale and small beside her, whispered, "We can go home." Because she realized, finally, she didn't have to go home. She was home. They stayed only long enough to collect the papers, the stamped seal of the court tucked safely into her satchel like a torch carried through winter. Jasper didn't speak to her. He didn't look at her. As they passed in the hallway, his shoulder twitched like he might turn, but he didn't. He walked out of that courthouse the same way he had walked through life, convinced he would always have the final word. But this time, Ruth had taken it from him. The ride back was quiet. Sam slept for most of it, his cheek resting against her arm, and Everett drove with one hand on the reins and the other occasionally checking the sky. A storm was moving in again. Not heavy, not sharp, but the kind that blanketed the land and made it hard to see where one path ended and another began. At the homestead, Alma had kept the fires going. Delilah had sent word to the others. When Ruth stepped down from the wagon, she was met not with cheers or celebration, but something deeper, a kind of reverent calm, like a church right after the final hymn. Children peeked out from behind the barn. Men tipped their hats. Even Harlan, gruff and always too busy for formalities, removed his gloves and shook her hand. "You did it," he said. "No," Ruth replied, "we did." Winter dug in its heels over the next few weeks. Snow fell in quiet sheets, muffling the land, and each day seemed slower than the last. But there was warmth, too, of a different kind. More people arrived, some bringing supplies, others offering help. They'd heard the story. A widow who fought for her land. A crippled son who stood when no one expected him to. A man who had turned from solitude back toward the light. Everett didn't leave. He never said why. He simply stayed. Each morning he was out before dawn checking fences, repairing the shed roof, hauling water from the well when the pump froze. And each night he sat near the hearth, not speaking much, just whittling or sipping coffee while Sam told him about the rabbits he saw near the woods or asked again how long before the chickens laid eggs. One afternoon, as Ruth shelled peas by the window, Sam rolled up beside her. "Is he gonna stay?" She didn't pretend to misunderstand. "I think so." "Why?" "Maybe because some people don't realize they're home until they stop running." Sam nodded like that made perfect sense. "I think we should make him a pie." Ruth laughed softly. "You can do the hard parts," he said. "I'll do the tasting." The pie came out burned around the edges, but Everett ate every bite. Spring came with more letters, official ones this time. The mining company offered to buy back part of the land for 10 times what it was worth. Ruth declined. A reporter from Cheyenne asked to do a feature for a newspaper column about bravery on the frontier. She didn't respond. The land, once gray and bitter, bloomed in crooked lines of green. Everett planted a second field out near the creek, and Ruth, surprised by the steadiness of her own hands, built a second chicken coop beside the first. On Sam's birthday, the whole clearing gathered. They lit candles on a lopsided cake, and he wheeled himself up to the porch and gave a speech. "I thought we'd leave," he said. "When Pa died, I thought we'd have to." He paused. "But Ma stayed, and then Mr. Everett came, and now I know this land isn't something you just live on. It's something you become." He glanced at Ruth. She became it first. That night, after the last lantern was dimmed and the wind died down to a hush through the trees, Everett stood in the doorway, arms folded. "You didn't have to stay," Ruth said, voice quiet. He shrugged, didn't have anywhere better to be. She walked over and leaned beside him, both of them watching the moonlight play across the ridge. "You ever think about tomorrow?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Then sometimes, but tonight's enough." Ruth smiled. "It is." The door creaked shut behind them. The fire burned low. Sam dreamed in peace. And outside the land kept breathing, quiet, steady, not waiting for anything more than what it already held.